Hello students, I am Dr. Harpreet from Army Institute of Law, Mohali. The topic for the day is the evolution of the doctrine of basic structure and its impact on Indian constitutional law. Introducing the topic, the Indian Constitution was written by its founders in order to provide a certain amount of rigidity and stability over time. The Indian Constitution acts as the primary legal framework, providing a precise guide for the operation of all branches of the federal and state governments. Each of these branches is required to function within the constraints of the Constitution. None of them has the supreme authority. Any government activity must comply with constitutional provisions in order to be considered legitimate. The judiciary may create doctrines to guarantee constitutional supremacy in the event that it becomes necessary to evaluate the validity of governmental activities. To resolve constitutional crises, however, such doctrines ought to be applied only in exceptional cases. Developing policies and doctrines on a constant basis for every circumstance would be a serious danger to democratic values and the idea of separation of powers. The drafters of the Constitution carefully considered every detail when drafting a constitution that would give its citizens the finest possible governance. They did not, however, insert a particular clause in Article 368 that would have limited Parliament's ability to amend the Constitution. Due to this gap, Parliament was able to enact the controversial 9th Schedule protecting agrarian reforms from the court scrutiny and progressively changing the Constitution from one that allowed for restricted amendment to one that did not. As a reaction, the Supreme Court established the basic structure theory in the CoL1-L25-The case of 1973, so placing tacit limitation on Parliament's ability to amend the Constitution and giving the Constitution its supreme authority. The doctrine of basic structure has been developed by the Indian Supreme Court through a series of significant rulings over time which introduce a vital element of constitutionalism. This element is crucial for preserving the essence of the Constitution, ensuring the maintenance of the broader concept of rule of law. In the absence of this doctrine, the Constitution would merely be a legal document devoid of practical significance. Now coming to doctrine of basic structure. The basic structure doctrine is a legal principle that originated in India primarily through judicial interpretation. It states that while a constitution may be amended by the appropriate legislative authority, there exist certain fundamental principles, structures or features that form the core foundation of the Constitution, and these are beyond the reach of amendment power. Basically, it means that the legislative body's ability to amend the Constitution is restricted in order to protect the fundamental principles and structure of the document. In the landmark case of CoL1-L25-The versus State of Kerala 1973, the Supreme Court of India established the doctrine of basic structure. According to this doctrine, the Parliament can amend the Constitution, but it cannot change its basic structure. The concept of basic structure emerged in the context of a challenge to the Constitution 24th Amendment Act 1971, which aimed to limit the Supreme Court's power to review constitutional amendments. In its landmark decision, the Supreme Court held that although Parliament could amend the Constitution, it could not alter the core ideas that give the Constitution its basic structure. The court did not, however, define its basic framework precisely, leaving room for interpretation in later cases. A number of rulings throughout the years have shed light on what might constitute the basic structure, including democracy, federalism, secularism, judicial review, separation of powers, and the rule of law. There isn't a comprehensive list, though, and each case's specific circumstances will determine how each interpretation should be made. The doctrine of basic structure is important because it serves as a restraint of Parliament's ability to arbitrarily amend the Constitution. It ensures that while the Constitution can evolve to meet the society's changing need, its foundation principles remain intact. The doctrine serves as a vital barrier against the Constitution's fundamental ideals and principles being compromised by arbitrary amendments. It guarantees the constitutional framework's continuity, integrity, and stability. Now, I will be discussing with you evolution of basic structure doctrine in India. The basic structure doctrine is a judicial principle in Indian constitutional law that prevents the Parliament from altering the fundamental frameworks of the Constitution. Here are some landmark cases which evolve this doctrine. The first case is Shankari Prasad versus Union of India. This is of year 1951, Supreme Court judgment at page number 458. The case of Shankari Prasad is among the initial cases of the Honorable Supreme Court evolving the basic structure doctrine in India. Here, the court was concerned with the constitutional validity of the First Amendment Act of year 1951, which restricted the fundamental right to property. Upholding the amendment, the Supreme Court opined that the Parliament had the power under Article 368 to modify any part of the Indian Constitution by way of constitutional amendment, including the fundamental rights. Thus, the position of law after this judgment was that the state had the power to take away or restrict the fundamental rights of the people through a constitutional amendment, and such an amendment would not be even nullified by Article 13 of the Indian Constitution. The next important case is Sajjan Singh versus State of Rajasthan, AIR 1965, Supreme Court 845. During the advent of agrarian reform in India, the Parliament passed the Constitution's 70th Amendment Act 1964 to further amend Article 31A and bring a number of statutes within the ambit of the 9th schedule. Petitioners in this case being affected by the amendment raised an issue challenging the constitutional validity of the amendment, contending that a fundamental right could not be amended by way of Article 368. Upholding the validity of constitutional amendment and following the judgment of Shankari Prasad, the majority view held that fundamental right could also be amended by the Parliament, both prospectively and retrospectively, by virtue of its power under Article 368 of the Indian Constitution. Nevertheless, giving the dissenting view, Justice Mudholkar and Justice Hidyatullah opined that the nomenclature of the term fundamental rights indicated that these rights were inherent and fundamental to every citizen and hence should not be allowed to be amended or modified. The next important case is of Golaknath versus State of Punjab, 1967 judgment passed by Supreme Court and page number 1643. In the landmark IC Golaknath judgment, the Constitution's 70th Amendment Act 1964 was once again questioned after the Punjab Security and Land Tenures Act of 1953, which restricted the petitioners from holding more than 30 acres of land. The petitioners held that the statute to be violative of Article 14 and Article 19 Clause 1G, since they were not allowed to hold additional land and resultantly were unable to rent out this additional land, causing them economic losses. This was the first case where an 11-judge constitutional bench was made to adjudicate the issue. In a ratio of 6:5, the majority view held that the fundamental rights could not be amended in any manner. In the words of the court, fundamental rights are the primordial rights necessary for the development of human personality. They are the rights which enable a man to chalk out his own life in the manner he likes the best. Our Constitution, in addition to the well-known fundamental rights, also included the rights of minority and other backward communities in such rights. The fundamental rights are given a transcendental position under our constitution and are kept beyond the reach of parliament. Keshwanand Bharti versus State of Kerala and another. This case is of year 1973 and it is a landmark judgment of Supreme Court at page number 1461. The Keshwanand Bharti case turned out to be the longest judgment in the history of Indian legal system and also laid down the foundation of one of the most imperative doctrines, that is the basic structure doctrine. Here, the petitioners was the leader of the Adnir Muth, a religious sect in the state of Kerala. He held some of the land of this sect under his own name. Government sought to acquire a part of such land. Immediately after the Golaknath case, the 24th Constitutional Amendment Act was passed to nullify the effect of the judgment. The amendment provided that the Parliament had the power to amend or modify any provision of the Indian Constitution without being hit by Article 13. Thereafter, a series of amendments on the basis of 24th Constitutional Amendment were also passed to nullify the Golaknath verdict. Hence, the petitioners approached the Honorable Supreme Court contending violation of Article 25 and Article 26, which deal with the right to practice and propagate religion and right to manage religious affairs respectively. While the petition was still pending, the Kerala Land Reform Amendment Act of 1971 was passed, making amendments in the Kerala Land Reform Act 1963 and brought within the 9th schedule. Thus, the said law was also challenged. The case saw the largest constitutional bench of 13 judges to decide upon the matter. Pursuant to 68 days of hearing, the verdict of the case was passed with a ratio of 7:6. The court opined that the wide power of the Parliament under Article 368 of the Indian Constitution were subjected to the basic structure doctrine. Any component forming part of the basic structure was not open to amendment by the legislature. Justice S.M. Sikri states as follows: the true position is that every provision of the Constitution can be amended, provided in the result the basic foundation and structure of the Constitution remains the same. The basic structure may be said to consist of the following features. First, the supremacy of the Constitution. Second, republic and democratic form of government. Third, secular character of the Constitution. Fourth, separation of power between the legislature, executive and the judiciary. And fifth, the federal character of the Constitution. The basic structure is built on the basic foundation, that is the dignity and freedom of the individual. This is of the supreme importance. This cannot be in any form of amendment be destroyed. The court also said that preamble was an intrinsic part of the basic structure as it is the basis of the Indian Constitution and envisages the fundamental rights for all the people. The court also established the golden triangle consisting of Article 14, Article 19 and Article 21 of the Indian Constitution and held that same bounds the Indian legal system. The judgment acted as a cornerstone of the Indian Constitution, which secured the right of the people and ensured that the amending power could not be usurped by the Parliament to get political gains. It reserved the essence of the Indian democracy and ensured that constitutionalism continues to exist in the country. The next important case is Indira Nehru Gandhi versus Rajendra Narayan. AIR 1975 decided by Supreme Court at page number 159. Keshwanand Bharti case had already laid down the foundation of basic structure doctrine in India by holding that certain parts of the Constitution cannot be amended in any manner. Just 2 years later, another issue in the form of a case of Indira Gandhi versus Rajendra Narayan came up before the court. The facts were such that Allahabad High Court had invalidated the petitioner's election owing to a corruption and malpractices. As a consequence, the Parliament passed the 39th Constitutional Amendment Act to invalidate the judgment. The amendment provided that the President, the Vice President, the Prime Minister and the Speaker of the Lok Sabha could not be subjected to the judicial review, thereby nullifying the effect of Allahabad High Court's judgment. Eventually, the amendment was constitutionally challenged, contending whether it was permissible to nullify the effect of the judgment and also the effect of the procedure concerning the election. The Supreme Court held that free and fair elections form part of the basic structure doctrine and hence the clause was held to be invalid. Further, the court added a few more elements to the doctrine, one of which was democracy, implying free and fair elections. Other elements included judicial review, rule of law and Article 32 empowering the Supreme Court. The next important case is of Minerva Mills versus Union of India, AIR 1980, Supreme Court, page number 1789. In Minerva Mills Limited versus Union of India, the issue before the Honorable Supreme Court was the constitutional validity of Section 4 and 55 of the Constitution 42nd Amendment Act, which transgressed the limitation of amending power of the Parliament. The Parliament, by way of 42nd Amendment, introduced Clause 4 and 5 to Article 368, which in a sense excluded the amendments to the Constitution from being subject to judicial review and provided the Parliament an unrestricted power to amend the Constitution. The Supreme Court held that in India, the supremacy of the Constitution is the most crucial aspect. The power to amend the Constitution provided to the legislature thus cannot be an absolute one and it must respect the basic structure of the Constitution. If an absolute power is granted, the amendments would be outside the scope of judicial review, in which cases Article 13 would be a dead letter, as the legislature would escape the scrutiny of the courts. However, judicial review was viewed as a part of basic structure of the Constitution and the amendment could not bypass the powers of the court to scrutinize laws, including the constitutional amendments. The court also held that harmonizing the fundamental rights, that is part 3, and the directive principle of the state policy, that is part 4, is also a part of basic structure. The next important case is Madras Bar Association versus Union of India, 2015 Supreme Court cases, page number 583. In Madras Bar Association case, the issue before the Honorable Supreme Court were threefold. Firstly, the constitutional validity of the NCLT and NCLAT on the grounds that it violates the basic structure of the Constitution. Secondly, the prescription of qualifications included term of their offices and salary allowances etc. of the President and the members of NCLT and as well as the chairman and members of the NCLAT. And lastly, the criteria for selection of the committee for appointing the members of both the tribunals. The Supreme Court did not accept the contentions of the petitioners. It was held that the NCLT and NCLAT are complainants with the basic structure of the Constitution as it was in consonance with the separation of powers, judicial review and independence of judiciary. The Parliament is empowered to create a law which transfers a judicial functions on a specific subject to any tribunal, given that the tribunal shall follow the principles of natural justice and the provisions of the Constitution. Additionally, the jurisdiction of the court can be shifted to tribunals if it would abrogate dependency and delay. Thus, NCLT and NCLAT were held to be constitutionally valid. The next important case is Supreme Court Advocates on Record Association versus Union of India. This case is of year 2016. One of the very recent cases on basic structure doctrine is NJAC case of famously called the fourth judge's case. By virtue of the 99th constitutional amendment, the Parliament replaced the then mechanism of the selection of judges with the National Judicial Appointment Commission, that is NJAC. The initial composition of NJAC was thought to be comprising of Chief Justice of Supreme Court along with 4 senior most judges of the Supreme Court. However, at the time of enactment of NJAC Act, the commission was composed of the Union Minister of Law and Justice and 2 eminent persons alongside the Chief Justice of India and 2 senior most judges. Resultantly, the petitions were filed challenging the constitutionality of amendment and NJAC Act, raising the serious concerns that impugned law affected the independence of judiciary and caused lack of transparency and accountability. By a ratio of 4:1, a majority view held that the said amendment and act were violative of the basic structure doctrine since it affected the independence of judiciary by including the executive in selection process and judges. The court was of the view that the impugned law goes against the judicial precedent set in Keshwanand Bharti and Minerva Mill case. The only dissent, that is, Justice Schleppeswer opined that the present collegium system, which is full of defects, could have been corrected by the constitution of NJAC. He stated NJAC could have acted as a check on unwholesome trade-offs within the collegium and incestuous accommodation between judicial and executive branches. By upholding the basic structure doctrine, the judiciary has reinforced the principle that while the Constitution is a living document evolving with time, its fundamental ethos and principles must remain inviolable. This has contributed to the stability, continuity and resilience of India's democracy, ensuring that no government, no matter how powerful, can erode the fundamental values upon which the nation is built. Thus, the doctrine remains a cornerstone of the constitutional governance, safeguarding the rights, freedoms and democratic framework of India for generations to come. Now coming to the impact of the basic structure doctrine. The significance of the basic structure doctrine in Indian constitutional law is profound. It has safeguarded fundamental rights, maintained the balance of power and ensured that constitutional amendments do not undermine the core values of democracy, secularism and federalism. Through its application, the doctrine has been crucial in ensuring the following factors. First, it preserves constitutional integrity. The doctrine strikes a balance between the need for constitutional flexibility and the imperative of maintaining the fundamental integrity and identity of the Constitution. This helps to maintain the integrity and stability of the constitutional order. Basic structure seeks to preserve constitutional principles and the basic ideals envisioned by the founding fathers. Second is uphold constitutional morality. It upholds the principle of constitutional morality and ensures that constitutional amendments adhere to the overarching value of justice, equality and fairness. Third, maintains supremacy of the Constitution. The doctrine has helped to maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and has prevented its destruction by a temporary majority in the Parliament. Fourth, prevent authoritarianism. This doctrine acts as a bulwark against authoritarian tendencies to dismantle democratic institutions or undermine constitutional norms. Next is separation of powers. Basic structures strengthen our democracy by delineating a true separation of power where the judiciary is independent of other 2 organs. It protects fundamental rights. Basic structure protects the citizens' fundamental right against the legislature's arbitrariness and the authority holders. Constitution as a living document. Being dynamic in nature, it is more progressive and open to change in time, making the Constitution a living document. Next is judicial activism. It has encouraged judicial activism in India, enabling the judiciary to strike down amendments that go against the Constitution's core and act as a check on the legislature and the executive. The basic structure doctrine has had a deep impact on Indian constitutional law by establishing limits on the amending power of the parliament. It safeguards the fundamental principles of the Constitution, ensuring that core values such as democracy, secularism and judicial independence remain intact. Now coming to the criticism of the basic structure doctrine. While the doctrine of basic structure of the Constitution has been instrumental in safeguarding the constitutional integrity and protecting the fundamental principles, it has also faced criticism from various quarters on the following grounds. First is lack of constitutional basis. One common criticism is that the doctrine is not supported by any explicit provision in the Constitution. Next is lack of clarity. This doctrine lacks precise definition and clarity regarding its elements. This ambiguity opens the door to judicial discretion and interpretation, leading to uncertainty and inconsistency in its application. The next criticism is inherent subjectivity. The determination of what constitutes the basic structure is inherently subjective and varies based on individual judges' interpretations, which can lead to conflicting decisions by different branches of the judiciary. Next is judicial activism. Critics argue that the basic structure doctrine vests excessive powers in the judiciary, enabling judges to engage in judicial activism and make subjective determination about constitutional amendments. Violation of separation of powers. By allowing the judiciary to intervene in the legislative and constituent powers of the parliament, it leads to a violation of the principle of separation of powers. Next criticism is it is undemocratic in nature. At times, it leads to undemocratic practices as it allows unelected judges to override the decisions made by the democratically elected representative. Stifling constitutional evolutions. By imposing rigid constraints on the amending power of the legislature, the doctrine may impede the evolution of the Constitution in response to the new challenges and circumstances in response to the changing societal needs. The doctrine of basic structure of the Constitution stands as a cornerstone of the constitutional jurisprudence, providing a framework for the preservation of fundamental principles and values inherent in the Constitution. It is a testament to the visionary foresight of the Indian judiciary that safeguards the foundational principles of the Constitution from arbitrary changes. Concluding my topic, in summary, the basic structure doctrine of the Constitution can be regarded as an important constitutional principle that has been formally incorporated into the documents by means of judicial interpretation. This well-defined doctrine strikes a balance between the flexibility and rigidity of the Constitution. It continues to be the pillar that has preserved our Constitution's original meaning, preventing unjustified changes, defending basic rights essential to the human development, upholding the rules of law, and preserving harmony between all branches of government. Thus far, the doctrine has shown to be a powerful instrument in evaluating the legitimacy of the constitutional amendments by limiting Parliament's unbridled power and keeping it from becoming the exclusive arbiter of legislation. But more thought needs to be given to how much of this doctrine can be modified in future. However, this doctrine has undoubtedly done a great deal for the country in turbulent times when Parliament seemed eager to amend the Constitution carelessly under Article 368. There have been cases in history where legislatures have misused their power to pass law for their own benefits. Such actions by the government have come at the expense of the constitution itself. Whether it was prior to Keshwanand Bharati verdict during the international emergency of 1975 or through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1976, which limited the power of judicial review. Preserving Indian democracy and preventing the parliament from misusing its majority power have been made possible in large part by the basic structure doctrine. Therefore, the basic structure doctrine ought to keep up its role as a protector of constitutional government. Discussions concerning the elements of the fundamental frameworks are valid and ought to be promoted. These discussions are a natural part of democratic politics and show the openness, diversity and dynamism of our democratic system. That's all for today's lecture. See you in the next lecture. Till then, thank you and goodbye.